Right? You ever have this moment where you hear people get all amped up and excited? Watching that video gets me amped up and excited. Took the kids to the high school football game this past Thursday night, and as we're walking to the stadium, you hear all the players doing what? Let's go. And as Christians, I feel like we walk around like this. Let's go. Go, Jesus. Sometimes we need to get a little amped up in our faith. The reason I say that is today we're going to be embarking through a message, through a text that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to look at how we can put our faith over our fear. Because this is where we're at right now. We're Labor Day weekend, and we might as well call this New Year's Eve 2.0. Because come Tuesday, everyone's schedule resets. If you have kids, your school schedule has been resetting if it isn't about to reset. If you don't have kids, guess what? Your traffic patterns are about to reset. It's like come this time of year when we all of a sudden take the pumpkin spice lattes out, we then now have this sudden reset of our lives. Summer seems to be coming to a close. Fall is coming here, and everything seems to be changing. And what happens when things change in our life? Oftentimes, fear creeps in. It might be the little fears, or it might be big fears. For kids who are in here, it might be fear of meeting your teacher for the first time, meeting classmates, changing schools, whatever it might be. For us as adults and as we get older, it's fear of our routines changing, or maybe it's even bigger fears as we'll get into. No matter what, we are now in a season and in a time where there's some sort of fear. And the question we have to ask is, do we have faith that is greater than the fear? Or is our fear greater than our faith? Are we walking around like Christians that are bold and, our God's got this. He does shut the mouths of lions. Or are we walking around timid and afraid, not knowing what is going to come next? Our text for today is going to be found in Matthew chapter 14. If you want to take one of these black Bibles out, this is for you to keep or for you to give away. Take this Bible, it is yours. Gift it or take it, whatever you choose. Take this Bible with you, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. And you're going to see the title there of Jesus walking on water, and we're actually going to see someone else walks on water in this text. It's Jesus' disciple Peter. And as we go into this text, we're going to be looking at where do our fears and our faith relate to one another. Some of you were children in the 1960s, and Johns Hopkins University did a study where they said that the greatest fear of a child in the 1960s were animals, dark rooms, high places, strangers, and loud noises. Some of you are like me, and you grew up in the 90s. In 1990, the greatest fear for a child was divorce, nuclear war, cancer, pollution, and being mugged. What changed? They did another survey more recently, and they say that kids are most afraid of many of those things, as well as bullies, strangers, and their school performance. These are the fears that many kids have. What am I going to do with those fears? How am I going to overcome those fears? Part of it is, how did they get those fears in the first place? The other thing is, how are they going to fight through their fears? As we grow older, our fears may change, but they never go away. Some common fears that I could think about is, maybe you're in the place where you're just trying to wonder, how are you going to provide? How are you going to meet the day-to-day needs of your family? I'm hearing this more and more is something that people are struggling with. Even though their income level seems to be more than they maybe thought, their expenses seem to be more than they ever thought, and they're just worried to go to the grocery store. Some are worried about saving for the future. Some are worried about spending. Are they going to have enough? My grandpa always told me, you either die too early or you die too late. You either die with too much money or you die with not enough. Sometimes we get to the place of our lives where we fear if we're going to run out. There's the loss of relationships. Maybe something has changed in our life where we feel like we've lost the relationship. And this often leads to loneliness and fears that come with being lonely. This is just a small list of many fears that I could add, but I promised my family I'd keep it shorter today because it's Labor Day weekend. In his book, Fearless, Max Lucado said this: the Gospels list some 125 Christ-issued imperatives. Of these, 21 urge us to not be afraid or not fear, or have courage or take heart or be of good cheer. The second most common command, to love God and neighbor, appears only 8 occasions. If quantity is any indicator, Jesus takes our fears seriously. The one statement he made more than any other was this: don't be afraid. Lucado makes the point that our church's mission statement, love God, love people, Jesus does mention that 8 times. 25 times, though, he's reminding us as believers to not have fear, to not be afraid, to take courage, to take heart. And what is he ultimately saying? To trust in who? In him. Reality is, I think, when push comes to shove, sometimes that's easier to say than it is to do. The question I have for us to wrestle with before we dig into this text: are you focused on your fears? Are you focused on the things in your life that you're afraid of? Or are you focused on the one who could overcome those fears? When I started here at Fellowship, many of you know I had a great fear of heights. In fact, we have a ranch. In the first year I ever did Christmas lights, I had to call my father-in-law because I was scared to put the Christmas lights up. And I'll never forget Jessica looking at where I was on the ladder and where the ground was. Where I was at the ladder, where the ground was. And she goes, "You needed my dad?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, "You're 6'4". You could hang from the gutter and it would only be a 6-inch fall. But I was so afraid of that height because it was a fear inside of me. Then I started here and we painted that peak up there. And I've been on the roof a ton up here because, they decide that all the HVAC things need to be on the roof. Go figure. And you have to suddenly do what? Conquer your fears. And how do you conquer a fear like heights? It's by staying focused on where you're going and not focused on where you've been. When I'm on a roller coaster, you better believe I look up at the sky. But it helps. It helps you overcome because before you know it, you're at the very top. You're at a place you never thought you could be. And it's all about where you were focused. When I was on that ladder hanging the Christmas lights, I was focused not where I was, but on the ground 6 inches below me. And that caused great fear. But when you change your focus, the fear seems to shift. And this gets us into our text. Are you focused on your fear, or are you focused on the one who tells you to take courage and to overcome it? Verse 22 is where we start, and what had just happened, for some context, is Jesus had done this miraculous thing. He fed 5,000 people, minimum. It was 5,000 men, and then we know that there were women and children and all that. 5,000 were fed with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. Kind of crazy. He does this miraculous thing. The crowd is following. Can you imagine what the crowd would be like? Like, oh my goodness, do you see what Jesus did? This is incredible. This is amazing. He took a Happy Meal and he multiplied it. This is amazing stuff. And then it says this in verse 22. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. Hey, Bartholomew, can you get some of the guys and gals and get in the boat? See all these people? Get away from them. Get in the boat and go across the lake. Just go. And so what do? They get in the boat. Seems pretty simple, right? And then what does Jesus do? It says this, that after sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Jesus is in the hills alone at night, praying. The disciples are out on a boat alone at night. Night is scary, is it not? I'm reminded of a pastor friend of mine who he had someone from the city come in, and there's a big old mosque being built next to their church. And someone from the city came in and he said, hey, how are you going to feel every single night when this mosque's shadow is all on the church? And he says, fear comes in the night, but joy comes in the morning. How's the mosque going to feel when the church's shadow is on them in the morning? It's all about perspective, right? But nighttime is often a scary time for us. It's often a nerve-wracking time. It's the time where maybe we don't see things as clearly as we once did. And Jesus in this nighttime goes away to pray alone, and he sends the disciples on a boat. It doesn't seem like the smartest move. If you've ever been out in the wilderness or on the lake at night, it's beautiful in some ways, but it's scary in other ways. And so as we look at how we conquer our fears, the first thing we learn is from Jesus himself, that Jesus spent time alone praying. It's not about the context of where he was, but it's about what he was doing. Here, Jesus just sent the disciples away. He had just fed 5,000 men and then the women and children after them. There was this mass gathering, and he doesn't say, you know what, I'm going to make my political rally right here. I'm going to get more credibility. I'm going to just sit here for hours and hours, and I'm going to build on this momentum. No, what does he do? He says, I'm going to get to what matters most, and that's time with my Father. And he goes and he prays. My question for us is, in our life, are we so worried about the things that we have going on in life that we aren't focused on the one who centers our lives? How much do we spend our time waking up every morning thinking about our tasks and what we have to get done before we even think about God? How often are we driving from thing to thing to thing, and all of a sudden the day, the week, the month, the year, the decades have gone, and God has been on the back burner the whole time? There's so often we have all these things to do that we busy ourselves in the things of the world, and we forget about the God who got us where we're at in the first place. So often our fears are centered around what we're doing, because we're not even spending time with God who gets us through them. There's a famous quote by Martin Luther, the reformer, who said, I'm so busy, I have so much to do that I'm going to get up 2 hours earlier to pray. What's our focus? Where are we centering our lives? We go, but no God. So where do we get our purpose or our mission or our direction if that's how we're living our lives? So often we're focused on what we have to do that we lose focus on the one we do it for. I remember when I was in seminary, I had mentors warn me of this, and me being an arrogant mid-20-year-old guy said, it'll never happen to me. They said to me, don't let your studies of God take you away from your relationship with God. There were so many times in seminary that I was overwhelmed by the 500 plus pages I had to read in the week. all the papers I had to write, all the studying that I had to do, that I forgot who I was doing it for. I was so focused on God being academic and something that I had to attain, rather than God being the one who was there, calling me there in the first place. And there was that moment. It was a moment when I met a man from Ghana who had made the whole trip to seminary, and here he and I are having Buffalo Wild Wings for the first time in his life. Talk about an eye-opening experience. Two things that were eye-opening for Daniel. Number one, in Minnesota, he was wondering why it was sunny out, but it was cold. He said, where I'm from, when it's sunny, it's warm. You go to the shade. Where you're supposedly from, you run to the sun to try to get some warmth that doesn't exist. But it was there that I realized the perspective. That why he was there, what he did, how he and his wife lived their life, it was all about the purpose and the calling of God, and it was less about trying to attain the degree. And it was there that I realized I got to get real about my personal time with the Lord. I got to get real about how I'm focusing myself. We can get caught up even in good things like studying God, that we forget about Him. And so then we get to the setting, which is going to lead to our second point. We find this in verse 24. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble. This really is just a great way to start. Jesus is up praying on the hill. The disciples are out on the lake, and it says they're in what? Trouble. How often do we feel like we're in trouble and Jesus is just gone up on a hill somewhere? Here they are, and they feel like they're in trouble. It says why they're in trouble, because they're far away from the land. A strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. They did not have 350 horsepower engines on their boat, okay? They were rowing. Waves are hard enough to fight with 350 horsepowers doing the work for you. Imagine fighting waves without any power. They're fighting the waves here in this situation. And what do we learn from this? We learn that the disciples followed the instructions of Jesus, yet they still had to fight a storm. Did they go out on the boat because they chose to go on a nice boat ride in the middle of the night? No, Jesus sent them on the boat. Jesus was the one who said, go cross the lake, get on the boat. And even though they followed the instructions of Jesus himself, they still had to fight a storm. The number one thing I can tell us as believers, as followers of Jesus, is just because we follow Jesus doesn't mean there's no storms in our lives. Oftentimes, following him means the storms come even more. You see, following Jesus is the greatest gift we could ever be given. But there's sometimes where we're fighting those waves, and we're rowing, and we're paddling, and it's hard. Do you remember the big rainstorm from a couple weeks ago? I almost posted a photo of it, and then I realized that my foot was in the photo, and no one wanted to see my foot. But at my house, there was about this high of water in my street. It came all the way up my driveway, all the way up my neighbor's driveway. There were even pictures of people with kayaks in our street. We had 5.8 inches of rain in like 90 minutes of time, and the drains just couldn't keep up. One thing I learned from that little incident is, A, God did protect my sump pump. Praise God. But B, I also learned that no matter what I did, I was not going to stop the water, was I? I was pacing around the house. I was looking outside. I was checking that sump pump as it went every 2 seconds, I felt like. I was trying to do everything I could, but could I stop the rain? No, I couldn't. So often we try to put plugs in the sky, for lack of a better term, trying to stop everything that we're afraid of, but the reality is maybe God wants us to learn something from it. Just like the weather that we can't stop. There's times we can't stop the storms in our life. And often those storms are way worse than just weather. There's storms that maybe deal with relationships, storms that deal with health, storms that deal with family or friends or people close to us. In these storms, they can be terrifying. But like the disciples had to be reminded, they didn't choose to go out on the water. They were following the instructions of the Lord. And if we look at the story, we could come to a conclusion that if God got them into it, do you know what God was going to do? He was going to get them out of it. They just maybe lost a little perspective. And we see that because the next thing happens in verse 26. So then about 3 o'clock in the morning, this is a convenient time, Jesus. Did Jesus ever sleep? That's what I want to know. Like here he is, fed 5,000. He goes and he prays to God the Father and he says, I'm going to take a 3 a.m. stroll. Like that just seems interesting to me. So 3 a.m., Jesus goes out and he came toward them walking on the water. Well, Robert, this is insane. This is crazy. Yeah, it is. He's also God. He also rose from the dead. So he comes out walking on water, and then the disciples saw him walking on the water. They were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." So what happens? Here they come out on the water, and they're afraid because, well, I'd be afraid too. Let's just be real. Someone's walking on water, number one. It's 3 a.m. That's even freakier, okay? Am I awake? Like, what is happening? But yet, Jesus is coming. And I want you to imagine being them for a second. Yes, you just witnessed a huge miracle, but this is even bigger. But this is what I can conclude from what we just read. Fear can cloud reality. Was it a ghost walking on the water? No. We see that it was Jesus. But what did they think it was? A ghost. How often does our view of what's really happening get clouded, get jaded, gets changed because of our fear is clouding it, rather than us taking a second and saying, no, what is reality here? It says this, in the fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." And as we know, it wasn't a ghost. So how do we often let fear cause us to not see clearly? I debated this illustration a ton. So I'm giving a lot of disclosure, okay? But I couldn't avoid it. So hopefully it's worth it. 2020 was a really hard year for a lot of us, right? None of us want to talk about it anymore. That whole COVID-19 thing happened. And as I reflect back on it, I realize as a society it was a lesson. It was a lesson on how we let our fear cloud reality. I'll give you an illustration. Do you know what the number one police call was here in Sterling Heights during that time? Hey, 911, this is so-and-so. We have 2 kids playing basketball at the park. Can you send an officer? That was the number one call. We were so scared of COVID that kids playing basketball outside on a basketball court made us afraid. Now, would that actually be something that, if we look back, was going to spread COVID-19 like wildfire? Probably not. They just released all the data on the masks that we as a church even were very, hey, we're going to love our neighbor, we're going to love people, we're going through it, so hear me out. But they've done all the studies and they said they didn't work. So what did we do? We let our fear cloud our reality. And I use that illustration because the reality is we let fear sometimes dictate what we do rather than stepping back and saying, what is the reality here. And this goes across our life in so many different ways. I'm not trying to bring back like some serious PTSD that a lot of us have from that time. But what I am trying to do is use it as an illustration to see how when we have a fear of something, we often act in a way we normally wouldn't act. We act differently. We do things differently. Sometimes we even get crazy, like calling the cops to come respond on a 911 call because kids are playing basketball. Fear can cloud reality. It was in their fear that they cried out, "It's a ghost." So how do we conquer these fears? That leads us to our fourth point. Fears are conquered when we step into them. Fears are conquered when we step into them. Jesus, it says in verse 27, spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. I'm sorry, but like the cynic in me wants to be like, "Okay, you're walking on water, dude. How am I not supposed to be afraid? It's 3 a.m. I'm not sleeping. I'm fighting waves. How am I not supposed to be afraid?" And I just see Jesus being like, "Don't be afraid. Just chill out, dude. Take courage. I am here." And isn't that a word that we so often need to hear? Whatever fear you're going through, whatever is happening in your life, I want you to hear the words of Jesus. Do not be afraid. Take courage. I am here. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of what you're going through. Do not be afraid of the trial you're in. Don't be afraid of this season, because take courage. I am here with you in it. Jesus, we can talk about him walking on water. Here's the thing. He was on a hill, and now he's in the stormy sea. What is he showing about his heart for us? I meet you in the storm. I meet you in the waves. I meet you in the sea. He didn't miraculously take the boat, fly it up to the hill, and then say, "Hey, I freed you from it." No, he got himself off the hill, went down to the water, crossed the stormy sea, and said, "Look, I am here." How often do we need that in our lives, that reminder that he is here, to take courage, to not be afraid? He then goes on. It says, "Then Peter called out to him, 'Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on water.'" I love this passage right here, this verse particularly, because here in verse 28, what do we see? Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, Peter, get out of the boat and come walk to me." I think so often, at least in my life, I've looked at it that way. No, Peter says, "Jesus, if it's really you, I'm about to walk out of this boat and onto these waves." Do you see the boldness of Peter? Do you see what he's saying? He's saying, "Let me walk on water, Jesus. Let me come out into this storm. Let me come out off of this boat, this safe boat. While it's rocky, it's a lot safer. Let me get out of this boat and let me walk on the water." Jesus isn't the one challenging him to do it. He's the one who says, "I'm going to do it." He took a step right into the fear, a step right into the storm. And what does Jesus say? "Come on. Come on." So Peter went over the side of the boat and he walked on water toward Jesus. This is absolutely amazing. The faith of Peter, the choice of Peter to do it. There's someone who's an author and podcast personality that I like to listen to, and I do listen to a lot of like non-Christians as well as Christians because there's things to learn. And his name is Jocko Willenick. Anyone hear of him? He's a U.S. Navy SEAL, an author, and he writes this: "Fear is normal. Every person feels fear at some point. But what should you do? Step. Take a step. Step aggressively towards your fear. That is the step into bravery. We are scared of what we don't know, and there is but one way to confront that fear. Step, go. In that simple action, this simple attitude answers so many questions. How do I get to the gym every day? You step and you go. If I want to conquer my fears, I got to take a step and I got to go. Too often I talk to people who say, yeah, I don't go to the gym because I haven't been in decades or whatever it is. And so they just give up. And they say, I want to go, but I don't go. And what is the argument? If that's your fear, just step and go. That's the only way to conquer it. What fear do you have in your life that you just need to step into and go? But, like Peter, sometimes we take that step. We step and we go. We start walking on the water. It was even our idea in the first place to get out on the water. It was our fear to say, you know what, I'm going to conquer that fear. I'm going to step towards that fear. But then just before breakthrough is about to happen, we give up. Just before we're about to see breakthrough, we give up. 69% of car accidents happen within 10 miles of a home. Sometimes we're right close to the destination. And yet, that's when the most pain, the most hurt, the most tragedy happens. And it's because we took our eyes off the road. We took our eyes off the one who was getting us through. Why do I say this? Because look what the scriptures tell us in verses 30 and 31. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. How did Peter not see the strong wind and waves before stepping out of the boat? He was fighting them with a paddle. He had seen them the whole time, but he saw Jesus, and he was so enamored with Jesus that he said, Jesus, I will walk on this water to come find you. He lost perspective of everything around him for a brief moment. You know, when our eyes are fixed on Jesus and we're going through a troubling time in life, guess what often happens? We don't even realize the waves around us. I've been in those seasons. Some of the most amazing seasons God and I have had have been the seasons that my life looks like a total train wreck. Those are the times where I'm like, I just trust you, Jesus. You're going to get me through, Jesus. I know you're going to provide, Jesus. My eyes are fixed on you. I'm focused on you. And everyone else around me is like, dude, your life looks horrible. And what do? I keep my eyes fixed on him. But like Peter, what happens? We look down for a second and we say, oh, crud, there's a lot of waves. And it's windy. And we lose our focus. I know he was almost there. He was almost to Jesus. Because it says Jesus immediately reached out. He reached out and he grabbed him. And he says, you of so little faith, why did you doubt me? Imagine this with me. Peter had been walking and walking and walking and walking and walking and looking at Jesus, and all of a sudden, plunge, because he took his eye off for just that split second. And how often do we get right there, almost to the point of breakthrough? We're about to conquer our fear, and all of a sudden we say, you know what? This is some waves and wind around me. But what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, oh, Peter, you got yourself into this, so you got to get yourself out of it. Good luck. It says he immediately grabs down and he reaches him up. I don't know where you're at in your life, but there are a lot of times where we take our eyes off of Jesus and we fall into that water. And it is by his grace, his love, and his mercy that he reaches down and he pulls us up. He says, you know what, Robert, you've been messing up, but I've got you. You know what, Robert, you took your eyes off me, but I got you. And so often in our life, we forget about that grace that he has for us. So don't say, oh my goodness, I forgot about Jesus this one time. No, he reaches down and he says, I got you. But then he doesn't leave you there. He doesn't just say, hey, you know what? I just love you so much that I will keep rescuing you without challenging you. I'm going to keep rescuing you without challenging you. No, what does he say? Peter, you of so little faith. In other words, your faith can be greater than this. I thought it was a lot of faith to get out of the boat in the first place. And now he's saying, but look, you took your eyes off of me. Why did you doubt me? I don't know what you're going through, but maybe you're on the verge of giving up. Maybe you're in this place where you're fighting your fears. Don't give up. Let Jesus be the one that only calms your fears, but also calms your life. It tells us in verse 32 and 33, when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. And then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. Jesus met them. He met them in the storm. He let Peter even go walk on the water and in the waves. He then challenged Peter, hey, look, Peter, come on, have a little more faith than this. Stop doubting me. And then what does he do? He calms the storm. Breakthrough happens. There are storms in your life. There are seasons that have a lot of white caps. But take courage. Don't be afraid. For what? I am with you, says the Lord. A quote that I want to leave you with is from an unknown author, but I can't take credit for it. Sometimes the Lord calms the storm. Sometimes he lets the storm rage and he calms his child. Sometimes the Lord calms the storm. Maybe there's a storm in your life and you need the Lord to calm it. But sometimes he lets the storm rage because he wants to calm his child. Maybe you're in a storm because he's teaching you something. He's asking you, fix your eyes on me. Take courage and take heart. Let's pray.